Our text for today, it lands us on one of the most beloved short stories in the Bible. Our very passage today is often quoted at wedding ceremonies, in movies. It's often featured in that art with fancy calligraphy at Hobby Lobby. It's the story of a mother-in-law, Naomi, and her daughters by marriage, Orpah and Ruth. And our passage puts us at the very beginning of this short story. And this story, it's just a series of social norms being broken, one after the other. We learn that Naomi and her husband left their homeland of Bethlehem to go live in Moab with their 2 sons because of a great famine. You see, Judah's hill country, it didn't really have a lot of rich farmland, and so famine was kind of a common occurrence. But it's important to note these 2 locations here. See, Moab and Judah, they had a long history of hatred, disgust, and prejudice. It went all the way back to Genesis 19, where Lot, Abraham's nephew, do you remember him? He had sex with his daughters and named one of the children from incest Moab. And so it's an entire culture of people that descended from an incestual relationship, and ever since, Israelites and Judahites had hated and despised Moabites. In Deuteronomy 23, it's noted that Moabites were excluded from the assembly of God for 10 generations. Israelites and Judahites have disputed with Moabites over territory and land for generations. So you can imagine that Naomi and her family, as people from Judah, were unwelcome a little bit in the land of Moab. It's very likely that they experienced a good deal of exclusion, possibly harassment, and you can suspect that their livelihood in Bethlehem was truly, gravely threatened for them to leave and go to Moab. But famine, it's a very frequent crisis you see in the Bible. Do you remember Joseph's brothers? They trekked to Egypt during a famine. And Abram, before he becomes Abraham, he ventures to Egypt as well during a famine. So Naomi's sons, they end up marrying 2 Moabite women, which is another social norm that is broken. It's an unlikely marriage pairing, but they end up marrying, and 10 years go by. And then an unthinkable tragedy strikes this mixed family. Probably due to some tragic accident in the fields or working on a house, Naomi's 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, die. And keep in mind that her husband passed away 10 years earlier. And these 3 women, they are left stunned at this major loss. Many of us know that heavy grief of losing a loved one. And these women, they have lost all 3 of their men. And not only is this a major loss, but it puts their lives in danger. Widows, they often fell into poverty very quickly after the death of their husbands, because those husbands were the only ones who could make a living for the family. The future has suddenly become quite uncertain for these 3 women. But Naomi hears that there is now bread again in her homeland. Now, she is completely heartbroken, but this is the tiniest light at the end of the tunnel for her. Food and God's providence has returned to Bethlehem, and she can come home. She won't be a foreigner any longer. But with this news of returning to her homeland comes yet another sorrowful parting. Surely Naomi's daughters-in-law will stay in their homeland of Moab. Their familial ties are broken, and surely they would fare better staying in Moab than becoming refugees in Judah. After all, Naomi knows personally how it feels to be a refugee in a country that doesn't welcome them, and she does not want them to experience what she has. And Naomi tells her daughters to stay, insists that they remain in Moab, and they weep together. And Naomi's insistence gives Orpah the freedom to make her decision to leave. But Ruth does not give in to Naomi's persistence. If the hand of the Lord truly turned against Naomi, as Naomi said, Ruth won't let her suffer alone. And through her tears, she tells Naomi to quit it. Quit your persistence. She's not changing her mind. The fact that Naomi and Ruth are so close is yet another surprising pairing. Often relationships between mother-in-laws and their sons' wives, they are riddled with complex dynamics. And a mother-in-law being so close to her Moabite daughter makes it an even more rare pairing. But our text tells us that Ruth clung to Naomi. And that verb, clung, it's the same verb used between husband and wife. And it connotes an unusual closeness between these two women. And it connotes a lasting covenant between these two that even death will not separate. Ruth says beautifully, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God, my God." It's a beautiful statement of loyalty, of incredible faithfulness, and demonstration of Ruth asserting herself and showing where she stands. And I find this exchange so beautiful on so many different levels. I love that it wasn't the logical choice for Ruth, yet she did not hesitate to go with her heart. I love that although Naomi's insistence that Ruth leave her could have hurt Ruth's feelings, it didn't deter Ruth from knowing where her heart lies. I love that Ruth's conviction didn't waver one bit, despite the fact that she wasn't tied to Naomi anymore, despite the fact that she was a Moabite going to live in Judah, despite the fact that she had much better marriage prospects in Moab. Despite all of that, she stood strong in her conviction that she wasn't going anywhere. Ruth stood strong in her choice. Her well-being was tied up with Naomi's well-being, and that was that. Ruth's choice was powerful. What stands out to me the most is that it was Ruth's choice to stay and Ruth's alone. I don't read a line here that God placed it on Ruth's heart to stay with Naomi. You see, Ruth knew what she wanted, without a doubt in her mind, and it came from a deep place of love and loyalty. And just like that, Ruth and Naomi's lives were changed forever. I think that we often forget about the power of our own choice in our lives. Sometimes it just feels like we are tossed and turned by the tide and the waves of life, and we don't have any say in the matter. And sometimes we get in these phases of life where we feel like we're just reacting to things that's happening to us, one right after the other. But we are actually gifted with the power of choice. It's been a part of our human DNA since humanity was created. And a good chunk of our faith journey, it's trying to walk that tension between our own choice, our own free will, and what God has planned for us. It's kind of this dance we engage in, at least I do, where we take gentle, light steps of our own choice, decisions and our judgments, kind of just waiting and sensing for the Spirit to guide us where we need to be next. We are told in Scripture that God knows what we say before we speak it, that God knew us before we were formed in the womb, knows the thoughts in our heads. We are taught that God is all-knowing, all-powerful, divine being, and that is just one of many reasons we come here to worship. We sing, He's got the whole world in His hands, and that's why I'm not your music minister. I fully believe in this all-knowing, all-being aspect of God. I find comfort in it. I am glad that God bears that burden for me of knowing everything, and those things I'm not ready to understand yet, God understands for me. And I believe that God opens doors for us at different parts of our lives. And I believe in those rare God moments, that liminal space where heaven and earth meet, right in front of our eyes, and we experience God. But I think that often we take that theology one step further into a potentially harmful space. We often use that all-knowing, all-being aspect of God to mean that God makes all of our decisions for us. And I've seen it a lot in my very short career as a minister. I saw it in that popular 1997 book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. I knew I would hear a noise over there. If you haven't heard of it, it's a book by Joshua Harris, and it was super popular when I was a college student. And it suggests a path to marriage that eliminates dating completely. And instead, it kind of taught you to be friends with the person you may have been interested in and go on these group dates, letting God guide the courtship into engagement. And while it seemed to work for some of the college students around me, it felt like a cop-out to me, a way to avoid that learning curve that dating requires, and just assume that God will lead you into marriage without any effort on your part. I also see it in the theology of everything happens for a reason, suggesting that all of our suffering and our tragedy is preordained by God to teach us something. And oftentimes that theology, it's accompanied by an apathy towards the direction of our own lives. If God has it all planned out for me, then I don't have control anyways, and I might as well try to learn a lesson from all of this. I see it in people who never take the jump on a big career decision, to finally take that leap into what they're passionate about, saying that they are just waiting for God to show them when it's time. And years go by, and feet remain on the ground. And I wonder if they will ever jump. And I find this theology, I find it harmful. I believe that God is all-knowing, all-powerful, but does that necessarily mean that it takes away all of my power as well? Does God really control every single aspect of my life, so much so that I don't need to be the driver at all? I can just sit in the back seat and relax. It leaves us with no sense of agency in our lives, and I don't think that's who God created us to be. The most harmful part of this theology comes when misfortune, bad luck, tragedy, failure enter a person's life. And then we are left to wonder why. Why did God plan this for me? What did I do to deserve this? We see this in Naomi in our passage when she says that God has turned his hand against her and caused all of this misfortune in her life. And it leads her to great bitterness. a type of bitterness that wants to build up walls around her, push her daughters away, leave herself alone to die. And without Ruth's insistence and presence, Naomi's life would have taken a very dark, short turn. And it's in these places of hardship within this theology that we feel absolutely powerless. Often people who go through a string of bad luck blame the world for their problems or blame God for their problems. And often we use that attitude as an excuse to not take responsibility for our choices, which leads to a whole mess of behavior. In this kind of theology, it makes us forget that we actually have the ability to choose. Every second of our lives, we have the ability to make a choice. We have the ability to react, to choose how we react to misfortune, bad luck, failure. We have agency over our own life. You have the power to make your own decisions, and you have the responsibility to live with your decisions. Free will, it's a beautiful gift and a great responsibility that God gives to each of us. And I think it's entirely possible to be rooted in choice and rooted in your Creator at the same time. In one of my favorite Jim Carrey movies, of which there are many, Bruce Almighty, it explores the idea of a human being being given the powers of God. And Bruce is a man who is leaning towards this theology of God giving him all of his bad luck and missed opportunities and just watching him suffer with great mirth. And he nurses that bitterness really hard. And so God shows up, played by Morgan Freeman, of course. And God gives him the powers of God for a few days, if only to prove that God probably does not control every single part of a poor person's life. In fact, one of the rules God gives Bruce, while Bruce gets to be God, you can't mess with free will. And towards the end of the movie, when Bruce has learned his lesson, God says one of my favorite quotes. People want me to do everything for them. What they don't realize is that they have the power. You want to see a miracle, Bruce? Be the miracle. It is a tough balance to be in relationship with the all-knowing Creator and Maker of the world while making our own choices in our life. But trying to walk that balance is where our relationship with God can grow. Being in relationship with God does not require we give up our own agency. In fact, it empowers our agency to create more good in God's world. I often think that the way that God comes down to earth, the way that God intervenes in our lives, is through us, through our own agency. And God gives us the freedom of choice to use our resources and our gifts to spread the gospel to the world that is right in front of us. The whole book of Ruth, if you read it, which I recommend you do, it's a display of Ruth utilizing her own power in the midst of harsh circumstances. She saw what life was giving her, and she refused to let it take away her power. And her decision to stay with Naomi is not the only time that she does this. Later on in the story, in perhaps one of the boldest and weirdest marriage proposals of all time, she hides in her future husband's threshing room so he can find her, and she asks him to marry her. If that's not agency, I don't know what is. And it's because of her agency that Ruth married Boaz and eventually became the great-grandmother of King David, and the ancestor of Jesus Christ. Our Christian faith, it does not require us to give up our power of choice. Our free will is a gift that God has given to us. And God wants us to use it to create kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. We have incredible power as human beings to turn our circumstances into opportunities, to take our gifts and use them to spread the gospel of love and acceptance in the world. Never let anyone or anything take that away from you. Amen.